Hello, I am Jordan, and this is going to be my third installment in a read along I'm doing of Never Call Retreat by Bruce Catton. I'm doing the read along with Steve Donahue, who has finally been able to join us, which is great. Steve, of course, knows far more about the material here than I do, and is, of course, far more familiar with Catton's work than I am. So he's a great companion, and he's also, of course, just far more articulate and engaging a speaker than I am. Um, that being said, I have very, very much enjoyed going through this book with him as a companion, and I do think that we see some kind of different things. We may be viewing things from slightly different angles, so I feel justified in making my own videos, regardless of the fact that I'm very much outmatched here. But anyways, this video will cover chapters 4 and 5, I believe. No, excuse me, 5 and 6. And next week we'll just cover chapter 7, which is going to be the concluding chapter in the book. This is the third volume in a trilogy Catton wrote to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the Civil War. I have not read the first two volumes, but this third volume uh, operates as its own work just fine, honestly. I mean, of course, you should have some kind of general knowledge of the way things developed if you're going to go into it. But overall, it's just, as expected, a wonderful reading experience. Catton is, he has such an approachable writing style without it ever feeling like he's like talking down to you as a reader. He can be quite lyrical without ever feeling stilted. It's just very, very assured, graceful, non-showy storytelling. On every single page, it's never ever dull, which is pretty remarkable, I think. But these chapters cover some intense moments. They cover a point at which the war was reaching a fever pitch of violence. Uh, in my opinion, that's largely due to the fact that early on in these chapters, or maybe about midway, um, Ulysses S. Grant is named general in chief and becomes kind of head of military operations on the federal side. And Grant had a tendency to um, simply throw human lives at a problem until it was solved. For better or worse, I think that the war had become so densely entangled in political and ideological and military mire that to a certain extent, Grant just kind of doing a slash and burn technique certainly accelerated things and pushed things in a direction that they were inevitably going in a much faster way than they perhaps would have gone. Still, it's difficult for me to feel fully justified in thinking of this man as a great man or as an important man because I mean, he was a bit of a butcher, I think, in just his attitudes. I think you could make the argument, like I said, that his behavior was necessary at that time. Still, I mean, is that kind of thing ever really necessary? I mean, the point is that I feel like the two central military figures in these chapters are Grant and then his henchman Sherman, who was as bad as Grant may have been. Sherman was much, much worse. Just a despicable, horrifically um, callous human being, and I think that was, of course, played out to even more on an even larger scale when he was later put in charge of continuing the genocide of the American Indian a few years after the Civil War. But here we have the beginnings or the lead up to his famous March to the Sea, which was a devastating blow to the South and was, in my opinion, unnecessarily um, vicious in its treatment of civilians and in its treatment of the natural wealth, the natural beauty of the South. Um, and then we have Grant's famous Battle in the Wilderness, which was some of the most horrific fighting in the entire war. I was going to read kind of a long passage describing that battle, which was also incidentally, I think, the first time that Grant came up directly against Lee. And it was, interestingly enough, a situation where neither one of them were able to really shine as generals. Neither one of their strengths were on display because the Battle of the Wilderness was such a just a tangled, bloody mess. It was impossible for any kind of tactics to go into works because it was impossible to know where anyone was at any time. I was going to read a long passage, but it was a little too long. Suffice it to say, it was a horrific battle, and you know, near the end or in the evenings, when fighting's kind of finally subsided, they had to listen to the screams of people being burned alive because everything was catching fire in the kind of early spring undergrowth. And just imagine fighting a battle during the heat of a forest fire, and you would have some indication of the way it's described here. So that's intense. It's intense reading. Really, though, I think what I found most fascinating about these chapters are what is perhaps the greatest miracle of the war, which was that the United States held an election during a civil war, successfully held an election during a civil war, and perhaps even more remarkably, Abraham Lincoln won re-election. Catton goes into great detail about the kind of political background and the political lead up to that. His opponent was the famous General McClellan, which is just such a it's got such a kind of novelistic symmetry to it that McClellan would be running as the opponent of Lincoln there. Of course, he lost. Lincoln won, and that's largely due, according to Catton, to the fact that there was a couple of massive turnarounds in the war right up leading to the election. One of perhaps the biggest one was the invasion of Atlanta, or the capture of Atlanta by Sherman, which really kind of changed Northern attitudes about the war. Catton makes the point, and Steve made the point in his video, that many of the military leaders in the Union at the time were under the impression that this was a war in which you capture territory, like it was a conventional war of territory, and that few people, Lincoln being one of them, and I guess Grant perhaps being another one, realized that this was really a war about destroying the enemy because you're fighting a rebellion. You're not fighting a sovereign nation, or at least that's the way that the northern states saw it. So the capture of Atlanta in itself, according to Catton, was not a big deal because it wasn't a direct blow to the lifeblood of the Confederacy, which was its people and its ideas. But it had a massive effect on attitude towards the war in the North because it came after some serious defeats and some serious slow going in the months after Grant became general-in-chief. Like, he decided to finally kind of attack on several fronts at once, which had not been attempted before. He aimed for a coordinated, massive, brutal assault on the South, and it didn't start out well. But a few victories, such as the taking of Atlanta by Sherman, ensured, according to Catton, that attitudes changed in the North, and as a consequence, Lincoln won re-election. So the very fact that it was actually, I wanted to read a passage Catton writes that Catton is writing regarding running an election during wartime. So he writes, no matter what the election said, the mere fact that it was being held was significant. It was an act of faith, an affirmation that even war itself must at last be subject to a decision reached at the polls. Perhaps the strangest thing about this strangest of all elections was that it never occurred to anyone not to have it. Whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated could long endure, well, they would vote. So I think that gives a sense, first of all, of Catton's very conversational and eloquent style, but also just the fabulous weirdness of the fact that this is a nation in civil war that comes together to hold an election. It's kind of inspiring in light of the fact that this country recently almost failed to have a legitimate transfer of power in peacetime. I don't want to get too much into current realities, but I do think that reading Catton, reading about the Civil War, and specifically reading Catton writing about the Civil War, really provokes some thought about the identity of the nation and perhaps the way ideas have changed in the way that the kind of battle for what this nation would become, that was the Civil War, has perhaps lost some luster and perhaps lost some of the kind of glory that it had pre, let's just say pre 2016. I do think that it's fair to say that any kind of glorification of this struggle is perhaps not a good idea. This was a horrific event in human history, not just American history. In many ways, it foreshadowed the horrors of World War I. There was trench warfare. There was just unbelievable casualties due to kind of technology moving faster than the human ability to adjust war tactics. And all of that was, of course, going to come to the foreground again a generation later in World War I. That being said, there is a kind of nobility to the cause that was kind of forcibly shoehorned into the war via the Emancipation Proclamation, which really changes the character of it in such a way that makes it a very inspiring story in a lot of ways. And looking at that inspirational story and looking at the struggle that that had to be fought in order to make this nation what it should have been from the beginning is a little bit discouraging given the low morale of this country as it stands now. Anyways, that's already kind of more I wanted to say about the subject. The point is that this is a fantastic book. I'm really looking forward to seeing what Catton does with the final moments of the war. And let me know what you guys are thinking of it if you are reading along with us. And thank you for watching. Have a good day.